Hi everyone, we're in a devotional in the book of Nehemiah called Rebuilding and Revival. And today we are looking at chapter 4, where Nehemiah did whatever it takes in order to overcome threats to accomplish what God had called him to do. So how do we overcome the impossible when we don't have an endless supply of time, energy, or money? We'll see in this chapter that achieving goals requires overcoming obstacles in our path by depending on God. I want to look at several relevant points for us today from this chapter. First, we see in verses 1 to 3, we see opposition, and we see that we have an enemy. And Nehemiah, as long as the people were content with their sad lot in life, the enemy left them alone. But when they began to serve the Lord and rebuild, the enemy became active. Now, the Christian's battle is not against flesh and blood, but against Satan and his demonic forces that influence those who oppose God's work. You know, if we focus on the visible enemy alone and forget the invisible enemy, we may start trusting in our own resources, and this will lead to defeat. We see Nehemiah faced ridicule. Do we see ridicule in our world today? You know, others will tell us it cannot be done. They will mock our efforts, and we see this in verses 2 and 3. What keeps you from doing God's will play into the hands of the enemy. People who don't want you to succeed, who don't believe in you, who say you will never amount to anything. You know, maybe that voice comes from a loved one, maybe an employer, or maybe from your own thoughts. You know, Satan likes to sneak in and attack between our ears with thoughts to cause us discouragement, pain, depression, anything to make us want to give up. Charles Spurgeon said, God had one son without sin, but he never had a son without trial. Next, we see Nehemiah's response, and we see this in verses 4 through 15. And we see in verses 4 and 5 that Nehemiah turns it over to God. How does Nehemiah respond? He didn't exchange insults or gossip, talking about people behind their back. He prayed and continued the work. He told God how he really felt about it and what he wanted God to do about it. Nehemiah had enough faith to ask God, believing that God could do something about it. And in verse 6, despite the ridicule, despite the odds, they were still able to work with all their heart. You know, dependence on God does not mean inactivity. We see their diligent work, though they did not stop the opposition. We see in verses 7 and 8 that the enemy does not back down. Just because we resist doesn't mean the enemy backs down. In fact, if our enemy sees that we're making progress, he will likely intensify the attacks on us. If you start making headway in your life, if you start making spiritual progress, a struggle that you're beginning to overcome, an addiction is regressing, things seem to be heading in the right direction, don't expect for one moment that Satan will back down. In fact, the spiritual attacks will probably intensify. We have an enemy who will not stop the attacks. We are to pray to God and put on the armor of God to stand firm and recognize there will be a temptation to give up. We see this in verse 10. We see that despair came. People got tired and weary. They became overwhelmed that they felt like they could not do it. Do you ever feel that way? You get tired and weary? Fighting the same battles, feeling like you're constantly having to climb uphill, feeling like your strength is giving out. Sometimes those around us incite in us more fear than encouragement. You know, paranoia and fear can be very contagious. Fear begins to spread rather than faith. We need to distinguish between the voice of God and all the other voices in the world and people around us who are telling us what to do. So what does Nehemiah do? He stands his ground. He prepares for a battle. He does whatever it takes to move forward and not back down. You know, pressures can often create problems from within. It isn't easy to carry on in your work when you're surrounded by danger, when you daily face the demands of a task that seem impossible. You know, discouragement is a key weapon in Satan's arsenal. The phrase, "we are not able," is the cry of all who take their eyes off the Lord and only focus on their problems. Fear paralyzes us. Nehemiah encouraged the people not to be afraid, but to look to the Lord for help. If we fear the Lord, we need not fear the enemy. Nehemiah tells the people in verse 14, don't be afraid. And we see this throughout the Bible. God is always reminding us not to be afraid. Likewise, Nehemiah reminds the people to remember the Lord. And I think we overlook this. We think to ourselves, well, of course I remember who God is. But we don't always act like it. We Christians can walk around in defeat, paralyzed by fear and anxiety and depression, so that we're acting more like atheists rather than someone who knows the Lord. It can happen to any of us. You know, the Bible continually tells us to not be afraid. Why? Because God is with us. Do you believe it? If we're full of fear, then we may not believe this as much as we think we do or would like to. Finally, in verse 15, we see God's intervention. We see that God frustrates the plot of the enemy. Do we have confidence that God will do the same for us? Are your eyes and ears open to any warnings that God may be revealing to you? Remember Nehemiah and how he did whatever it takes, and that we persevere by depending on God.